Just like in 2020, the UFC opens its pay-per-view offering in 2021 with the biggest star in mixed martial arts returning to the octagon, but this time it's to tackle a distinctly different kind of challenge. Relative to this weekend's UFC 257 headliner, last year's edition versus Donald Cerrone was nothing more than an inconsequential showcase. It had no title implications thanks in part to the division it took place in, and really the result was never in question. By contrast, Conor McGregor versus Dustin Poirier 2 is as close to a championship fight as you could get without the actual title being on the line. In some ways it even harkens back to their first meeting where Poirier was considered a measuring stick for the Irishman. Dustin, much like he did back then, will enter the octagon this Saturday a proven commodity, and McGregor, while far more accomplished, will once again be asked to answer some questions, namely, is he still elite despite the inactivity, debauchery and outside obligations? Still, despite the differences, the Cerrone and Poirier fights do have one thing in common, and it's that for McGregor, they both serve the same significant purpose, and that's rehabilitation. McGregor, more than anybody in MMA's history, has subverted the system that Zuffa built. Ahead of just his second bout, still positioned on the preliminary card, he was afforded the coveted lights out treatment normally reserved for main event and championship fights. A show at home in Dublin revolving entirely around his cult of personality soon followed, and then shortly after trouncing both Dennis Siver and Dustin Poirier, the man he'll face this weekend, he was off globetrotting on the first ever UFC World Tour opposite featherweight king Jose Aldo. But despite the bells and whistles, things didn't truly warp until after he felled Aldo in 13 seconds. You see, McGregor's rise to the title was actually reasonably traditional and linear. He fought a group of suitable opponents who gradually got tougher, and even welcomed short notice replacements like Chad Mendes when required. And if that isn't traditional by the UFC standards, then I don't know what is. Still, he's always been a big picture, escalatory kind of guy, forever chasing that next big thing, the next record, and therefore he never wanted to be the ruler of a solitary division like Aldo. So with the UFC's blessing in pursuit of hardware across multiple weight classes and, well, other things, he ditched his championship obligations. But remember, despite their apparent insatiable appetite for champ v champ fights these days, this was somewhat out of character for the UFC back then. Before McGregor, only one contest of the sort had happened, and that was George St. Pierre versus BJ Penn at UFC 94. The difference is that fight actually made some sense due to Penn's history with both the welterweight champion and his belt. McGregor, on the other hand, simply wanted to make history and escalate. Originally scheduled to fight Rafael dos Anjos for the lightweight title, he instead traded victories with Nate Diaz at welterweight after an injury sidelined the champ. Still, despite this extended detour, as well as the fact he was unranked at lightweight, having never competed there in the UFC, his title fight was waiting for him when he was ready to take it. And when he did, it was magic. In an impeccable performance, perhaps his best ever, he destroyed Eddie Alvarez, and as customary, he once again looked to escalate. Now the UFC's first champ, he demanded an ownership stake in the company before setting his sights back to Floyd Mayweather Jr., a man who he had not only been calling out for months, but one who, in many ways, influenced his career path most.
Come talk to me now, because no one's came talk to me since the sale has happened. Like, I mean, who owns the company now? There's people have shares in the company, celebrities. Conan O'Brien owns the UFC nowadays, so where's my share? Where's my equity? I've got both belts, a chunk of money, a little family on the way. You want me to stick around? You want me to keep doing what I'm doing? Let's talk, but I want the ownership now. I want equal share. I want what I deserve, what I've earned.
Give Floyd the Showtime, I'm coming. Tell him to run out Showtime offices. I want the 100 million cash to fight him on the boxing rules, because he's afraid of a real fight.
Generally, I try to avoid comparing mixed martial artists with boxers because they really do operate under entirely different conditions, but the parallels between Conor and Floyd are clear, and I find this part fascinating. For the first 10 years of Mayweather's professional career, he was actually a top-rank signed athlete, and it was a hugely successful partnership too. He became the consensus top pound-for-pound fighter, which ultimately led to his promoter, Bob Arum, brokering a career-best $8 million deal for him to fight Antonio Margarito in 2006. But for Floyd, that wasn't enough. He wanted $20 million to fight Oscar De La Hoya, a request Arum scoffed at, so Floyd chose to go solo instead, triggering a release clause that cost him $750,000 before earning $25 million the following year to fight, yeah, you guessed it, Oscar De La Hoya. Now circle back to where we last left Conor and you'll find some striking similarities. He was inching towards the top of the UFC's pound for pound rankings, for whatever that's worth, and while it's next to impossible to find genuine, complete UFC payouts, we know he was making real money by now, having earned $3 million against Alvarez before bonuses and pay-per-view points, which are usually substantial. The difference between McGregor and Mayweather in this instance though is a function of the difference between MMA and boxing. Conor had similar competitive and financial ambitions to Floyd, but like every other UFC athlete, he was bound to a far more restrictive contract. Unlike his peers, however, he did have some leverage, which is why I believe the call for equity and a fight with Floyd came successively. You see, McGregor eventually got the UFC to sign off on the Maymat crossover, but considering the alternatives, like giving him a piece of the business, which, let's be honest, was never going to happen, or maybe never seeing him compete again, this had to be considered a net win internally. Still, they had to know that their unwavering latitude would come with some consequences. Why? Well, the UFC, particularly since Dana White took the reins, have aggressively fought to shield MMA from boxing's greatest flaws, and have incidentally built a relatively contained sport. Unlike in boxing, where its politics makes business exceedingly complicated, in MMA, and especially in the UFC, business almost always eventually gets done, since the promotion holds so much power. That right there is the problem though. They must be in command to make this system function correctly, and if they're not, it breaks down, which is what happened with McGregor. For him, getting the Mayweather fight wasn't the truce. He continued to push for more control, and the call for ownership never really went away. But unlike with Floyd's case, there was never really a scenario where he truly won. Not how he wanted to anyway, so the system seized up. Now there are two conflicting sides to this story. If you're focused on a labour relations angle, his efforts were in many ways admirable, but if you're looking at it from a fan's perspective, which, let's be honest, most people are, well, his actions weren't exactly conducive to delivering what we've been conditioned to like or expect. We don't want Mayweather types who fight once a year and retire on a whim, nor do we want so-called moneyweight fighters whose careers revolve primarily around celebrity contests and regular queue skipping. The fact is, despite the criticisms we might have of the UFC's business practices, of which most are totally fair, when their system runs smoothly, we do benefit greatly from them. Just look at the data. In the 4-year run that culminated in the Alvarez bout, McGregor competed 10 times despite undergoing ACL surgery. And for me, and I bet most people, that was by far the most exciting phase of his career. Conversely, in the subsequent 4 years, objectively the worst phase of his career, and the one where he and the UFC butted heads the most, he fought just twice, 3 times if you count the Floyd fight. He also quote unquote retired a handful of times, like 3 times. Or is it 4? I think it's 3, but I can't quite keep count. Granted, becoming a father and, well, other things have certainly contributed to McGregor's inactivity, but I suspect he acknowledged his part in fostering it because leading into 2020 we saw a shift. Having signed 2 new deals with the UFC which have, at least for now, met some of his expectations, including one that made Proper 12 an official UFC sponsor, and another that has the potential to make him an obscene amount of money.
I'm estimating a good 80 million.
He promised what he called a season in 2020, a slate of at least 3 bouts, kicking off with a curious fight against Donald Cowboy Cerrone. And coming off that massive showdown against Khabib Nurmagomedov in 2018, the Cowboy fight was, as Chuck Mindenhall wrote in The Athletic, the first de-escalation of McGregor's career. But here's the thing, if that was penned about almost anybody else, it would have unquestionably read as a negative, but relating to Conor at the time, my interpretation was quite the opposite, because after the excesses of the Mayweather circus and the chaos of the Khabib encounter, McGregor needed a reset, and Cowboy was the ideal conduit for that. Somebody like Dustin Poirier feels like a logical follow-up too. Firstly, it's the kind of contest MMA fans adore, in that it's a bona fide top contenders battle. And secondly, at a time where guys like Jake Paul are attempting to lure McGregor into an even bigger circus than Mayweather, this fight moves him from the fringes of the sport and places him right back into the centre. In other words, if McGregor for the last 4 years was operating in a UFC system subverted by his own doing, this is a return to the original. But perhaps the biggest play here was the season that he promised in 2020, and now his focus on a lightweight run in 2021.
I never got a good stint at 155 pounds, a consecutive stint like I done in the lightweight division or in the featherweight division. I'd like to do the same here in the lightweight division that I done in the featherweight division, give it a good run and tear through the division.
Unfortunately, the season didn't come off as planned, although to be fair, not much did last year. But now with the UFC having gained a handle on how to operate effectively within a pandemic, and with McGregor holding firm on a robust schedule, 2021 could rival even his best years. And while fighting the likes of Manny Pacquiao clearly remains a goal, fans will be far more forgiving for once-off crossovers if McGregor does indeed deliver on a run at 155 pounds. The division division long considered his best. It's not just that though, there's also something to be said about the clear reset to McGregor's gimmick, which had been deteriorating in parallel to his clash with the UFC. There's a trope in fiction called the Flanderization effect, named after this dude of course, and it's one I like to attribute to Conor. In short, it's the act of taking a single, often minor action or trait of a character within a work and exaggerating it more and more over time until it completely consumes them. And I think that really does describe what happened with McGregor. You see, when he first emerged, his trash talk was witty and clever and even sometimes insightful. But over time, that same trash talk devolved into something approaching parody, and it became such a caricature of his former self that the fights took a back seat to his bombastic persona. Against Cerrone and now Poirier, however, we've been presented with a different guy, a guy who has pushed that brand of trash talk to the background and respect to the fore. And while part of that is likely a function of maturation, I'd also suggest that another is by design.
I've been blessed in this position that I am in, and I'm going to continue to give back, and I'm very happy to share the octagon with Dustin, who is also of the same mindset, you know, so it's going to be a good bout. Similar with Donald, there will be blood spilled, but it will not be bad blood.
Now, none of this is to say that McGregor is being Machiavellian in any way. While it's clear that he's made a conscious effort to rehab his career, I don't think he's being deceptive. It's just that, like any businessman worth his salt, he's identified fundamental flaws in his enterprise and has implemented solutions to try to fix them. Moreover, it appears that certain things, like his newfound maturity and improving relationship with the UFC, have come at the right time to make it all even possible. This weekend, however, will mark the first critical patch. The return against Cowboy may have offered him the reset that he needed, but the fight against Poirier, which starkly contrasts every fight that he's had since he became a UFC champion, could change everything if he can capitalise.